Hey guys, before we begin, I want to take a second to thank the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are, and I want you to know that your message genuinely made my day. Comments and suggestions like yours are the reason this channel exists, and they shape every single video I make. It means more than I can say. And for everyone watching right now, if you enjoy what we do here, please consider hitting like and subscribing. It helps the channel grow more than you know, and if you have a topic you'd love to see covered, drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Also, a quick note, the channel is now live on Spotify, so if you prefer to listen, there's a link in the description. We would love to have you there. Now, dim the lights if you can. Put on a fan, if that is your thing. Pull a blanket up around your shoulders and get settled somewhere comfortable. Really comfortable. The kind of comfortable where you're not moving for a while, and that is perfectly fine, because we are going somewhere tonight. Have you ever wondered what a Tuesday morning actually felt like in 1953? Not the history book version, not the photographs, but the real, lived, sensory weight of it. The way the kitchen smelled before anyone else in the house was awake. The sound the percolator made when the coffee was almost ready. The feeling of a linoleum floor under bare feet at 6 in the morning when the house was still cold and the day had not yet asked anything of you. What did a 1950s housewife actually do between the hours of 7 and noon? And what did she do after that? What was the grocery store like on a Wednesday? What did Saturday afternoon feel like when the lawn was mowed and the windows were open and there was nowhere anyone needed to be? What did Sunday smell like? The pot roast, the church clothes still hanging on the door, the funny papers spread out on the living room floor. What did it feel like to run a household with nothing but 2 hands, a schedule no one wrote down, and the quiet, unspoken understanding that you were the engine that kept everything moving? And just like that, it is 1953. The percolator is already bubbling on the stove. Somewhere outside, a screen door bangs shut. The neighbour's dog is barking at something it will never catch. Your husband's lunch pail sits on the counter, waiting, and the week is just beginning. It is Monday, and the alarm does not ring so much as remind you of something you already knew. You're awake before it goes off, the way you almost always are. Your body tuned to the house's rhythms the way a musician is tuned to an instrument, alert to the smallest sounds, the creak of the furnace, the faint shift of light behind the curtains, the particular quality of silence that means it is time. You slip out from beneath the blankets carefully so as not to wake your husband, and you move through the early dark of the bedroom with the unhurried confidence of someone who has done this so many times. The house itself knows your path. The floor is cold. Your slippers are where you left them. The kitchen is waiting. You pull your housecoat from the hook behind the door and wrap it around yourself as you move down the hall, past the children's rooms where the breathing is still slow and even, past the bathroom where the mirror holds nothing yet but shadow, and into the kitchen, which is the first room in the house to fully wake. You turn on the small light above the stove rather than the overhead, because the overhead is too much, too sudden, an intrusion into the particular tenderness of this hour. The lower light is gentler. It pools across the counter and the stovetop and the edge of the sink, and in it the kitchen looks the way it always looks at this hour, familiar and private and entirely yours. You fill the percolator at the sink, the water cold against your hands, and you measure the coffee the way you always measure it. The same number of scoops, the same pressure of the spoon against the grounds, a ritual so practiced it requires nothing from you except the doing of it. You set it on the burner and turn the flame low and stand there for a moment in the quiet, listening to the house. Outside, the sky is the colour of something not yet decided. A car passes on the street, headlights sweeping briefly across the window above the sink, and then it is gone, and the quiet comes back, deeper for having been interrupted. This is the part of the morning that belongs to no one but you. In 20 minutes the alarm will go off in the bedroom, and your husband will come downstairs wanting his breakfast, and after that the children will come down in stages, the oldest first, and then the younger ones, each of them trailing their own particular morning energy. The one who is cheerful before she's fully awake, the one who needs 10 minutes of silence before he can speak to anyone without incident, the one who will have misplaced something essential and will need your help finding it. All of that is coming. You know it the way you know the weather, the way you know the week, but it has not arrived yet, and so you stand at the stove in the low light with your coffee beginning to climb, and your hands wrapped around themselves for warmth, and you let the quiet be what it is. By the time the percolator signals its readiness with its particular bubbling insistence, you have already begun. The bread is sliced. The butter is out. The skillet is on the second burner, heating slowly toward the temperature that will take the eggs properly. You move between the counter and the stove with the economy of someone who knows this kitchen, the way a pianist knows a keyboard. Every drawer, every shelf, every quirk of the burner that runs a little hot on the left side. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is uncertain. You have done this Monday morning so many times that your hands know what to do while your mind is still half somewhere else, still sitting in the quiet that was, still listening to a house that has not quite finished sleeping. Your first cup of coffee is the best thing that will happen before 7 o'clock, and you know it, and you drink it standing at the counter rather than sitting down, because sitting down at this hour would be a concession to the morning that you're not quite ready to make. You hold the cup in both hands and you look out the window above the sink at the backyard coming slowly into shape in the early light. The fence, the garden, the oak tree your children climb in summer, all of it emerging from the dark the way a photograph emerges in a developing tray, gradually, then all at once. There is a sound from upstairs, a door, footsteps. The morning has made its first move. You set down your cup and turn back to the stove, and the eggs go into the skillet with a hiss that is the official sound of the day beginning, warm and immediate and entirely without sentiment. The house is waking up around you. The week is underway, and you are already in it, already ahead of it, already doing the 10 things that no one will notice because you did them before anyone was watching. This is Monday. This is how it starts. Not with fanfare, not with ceremony, but with cold floors and low light, and the smell of coffee and the quiet, competent understanding that the day needs you, and that you are, as always, ready. There is a version of the 1950s morning that no photograph ever quite captured, and it happens in the 10 minutes before anyone else in the house comes downstairs. You're alone in the kitchen, and the percolator is on, and the coffee is beginning its slow, gurgling climb toward a ready, and the whole room smells of something that can only be described as the official start of things. You stand at the counter in your housecoat and your pin curls, and you do not do anything in particular. You simply exist in the quiet. You watch the percolator, you listen to the house, and for a few minutes, just a few, the day belongs entirely to you before it belongs to everyone else. It is the strangest gift, this pocket of time, and the strangest thing about it is that no one gave it to you. You made it yourself, by getting up a little earlier than necessary, by moving quietly through the hall, by choosing the low light over the overhead so as not to announce yourself to a house that is not yet ready to be announced to. You're not hiding. You're simply here, in the way that people are here when they have claimed a moment rather than found one. The percolator does its work beside you, its sound a kind of low, dependable music, the bubble and push of it, the way the coffee darkens in the glass top as it climbs, the smell that has no real equivalent in the world outside a kitchen at this hour. It is the smell of readiness, the smell of a day consenting to begin, and you breathe it in the way you breathe in good weather or clean air, with a gratitude that has no particular object and requires no particular expression. Your pin curls are still in. You have not yet looked in a mirror, and you are not planning to, not yet. This is the hour when you are not on display, not even for yourself, and there is a freedom in that which is difficult to name but impossible to mistake. You exist in these minutes, at a remove from all the roles that will reassemble themselves around you the moment the first voice calls down the stairs. You're not anyone's mother yet this morning, not anyone's wife. You're simply the person standing in the kitchen, watching the coffee, listening to the house breathe. Outside, the neighbourhood is doing the same thing, more or less. On every block, in every kitchen that has its light on at this hour, there's a woman doing some version of what you're doing. Coffee on, family still asleep, the day balanced for one more minute on the edge of not having started. It is one of the quiet solidarities of this life, invisible and unspoken and real. You will not talk about it at the Tuesday market or across the back fence, but it is there, the shared knowledge of what this hour is and what it cost to make it and what it gives back. The furnace kicks on with a sound like a cleared throat. Upstairs, something shifts. The house is beginning its return toward consciousness, and you feel it the way you feel a tide change. Not dramatically, but unmistakably, the pressure of the day leaning in. You pour your first cup before the percolator has quite finished, the way everyone does when they think no one is looking, and the steam rises from the cup in a slow curl that catches the low light above the stove. You hold it. You breathe. You take the first sip, which is always the best one, always the one that has in it the specific promise of the entire cup, and then you hear it. The small sound that ends this part of the morning, a door, a floorboard, a voice not yet fully formed into words, just a sound that means someone is awake and moving and will need something soon. You set your cup down on the counter and turn toward the stove with the quiet efficiency of someone returning to their post. The eggs will need to go on. The bread will need to be sliced. The table will need its 4 places set, because that is how it is done in this house on every morning, without discussion or instruction. The 10 minutes are over. They were enough. They are always enough, because you know how to make them enough. And that is a skill like any other, the ability to take a small, ordinary thing and hold it until it becomes what you need it to be. The day is beginning, the house is waking up, and you, who are here first, are ready. By 7 in the morning, the quiet is over. Your husband needs breakfast on the table, his shirt pressed, his lunch packed, his coffee poured and waiting at his spot. Your children need to be dressed, fed, hair combed, shoes tied, arguments mediated, permission slips signed, and pointed in the direction of the school bus with enough time to actually catch it. And you need to manage all of this simultaneously, without a list, without help, and without letting anyone see how many things you're holding in your head at once. You do it the way you do everything, methodically, warmly, and with a competence so complete it looks effortless from the outside, which is precisely why no one thinks to mention it. Your husband comes downstairs first, already dressed, already wearing the particular focused distance of a man whose mind has moved ahead to the workday and left his body to catch up. He sits at his spot at the table the way he always does, unfolding the newspaper with the comfortable authority of someone who has never had to wonder whether breakfast would be there. And it is there. It is always there. 2 eggs, the way he likes them, toast with the butter already spread, coffee poured to the temperature he prefers without his having to say so, because you have been making his coffee for years and you know. The knowledge lives in your hands, not your head. Then the children arrive, in the particular order they always arrive, your oldest first, moving through the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who has places to be, grabbing her toast and her orange juice and her school books in a single continuous motion that speaks to a morning routine as practiced as your own. Then the middle one, slower, needing encouragement, sitting down and staring at his oatmeal with the philosophical resignation of a person confronting an unwelcome reality. And then the youngest, who is never quite ready, who appears at the kitchen doorway with her hair half combed and one shoe on, and an expression of absolute confidence that the rest of the world will simply wait. You move between all of them with the practiced fluency of an air traffic controller, a comb produced from somewhere, a shoe located behind the hallway bench where it was left last Thursday, a permission slip for the school trip signed against the counter because there is no time to sit down, a dispute about whose turn it is to carry the lunch pail settled with the swift, unnegotiable authority that only a mother at 7:15 on a Monday morning can summon. You do not raise your voice. There is no need. You simply know what each of them needs and in what order, and you move through the kitchen dispensing it with a calm that has nothing to do with ease and everything to do with practice. Your husband finishes his breakfast and folds his newspaper and stands, and the two of you exchange the small, familiar gestures of a weekday morning departure, his hat from the hook by the door, your hand straightening his collar once, briefly, by habit, his thank you that is more breath than word because it is early and the day is already pulling at him. The door closes, his footsteps cross the porch, the car backs down the driveway, and you turn back to the kitchen where your children are still in various stages of readiness, and the clock above the stove says there are 11 minutes until the school bus. You make those 11 minutes do the work of 20. This is another skill that has no name and earns no recognition. The compression of morning time, the ability to move 3 children through the final stages of preparedness without panic, without shortcuts that will cause problems later, without anyone arriving at school with their shirt untucked or their lunch forgotten on the counter. When the bus appears at the end of the street, all 3 of them are on the porch with their things, and you stand in the doorway and watch them go, your oldest first, your middle one second, your youngest last, turning once at the end of the walk to give you a wave that is both casual and, if you are paying attention, which you always are, entirely dear. The door closes. The house is quiet again, but it is a different quiet now, the quiet of a space that has been fully used and is now resting, the quiet that comes after effort rather than before it. You stand in it for a moment, just a moment, and then you roll up your sleeves and turn toward the counter, and the morning's real work begins. Monday was wash day, and this was not a casual arrangement. This was a cultural institution, as fixed and reliable as the sunrise, as understood and unquestioned as gravity. Every woman on the block knew it. Every clothesline on every block across the country would be full by mid-morning, sheets and shirts and pillowcases lifting in the breeze like flags of quiet industry. You sorted the laundry the night before, whites, colours, darks, delicates, and by the time breakfast was cleared and the children were gone and your husband's car had backed out of the driveway, you were already at the wringer washer, sleeves rolled up, the hot, soapy smell of Tide rising into the air around you like a cloud of honest work. The wringer washer stood in the basement or the utility room, or in some houses, out on the back porch where the water could drain without ceremony, and it was not a quiet appliance. It announced itself. The agitator churned with a rhythm that filled the room, that you felt as much as heard, a low mechanical pulse that was the sound of Monday doing what Monday was supposed to do. You fed the laundry in by hand, piece by piece, and you watched the water go from clear to grey, and you knew by the colour of it how dirty the week had been, which was a kind of information that told you something true about a family's life without anyone having to say a word. The soap was Tide, or Oxydol, or Does, whatever your preference and your budget allowed, and the smell of it was not a subtle thing. It was clean in the way that only laundry soap can be clean, assertive, almost aggressive, the smell of something being genuinely removed rather than merely covered. It rose with the steam from the hot water and filled the utility room and drifted up through the house and out the back door, and your neighbours could smell it from their own yards, and they knew without looking that you were on schedule, that your Monday was proceeding as a Monday should. The wringer was the part that required your attention. You fed each piece through carefully, guiding the wet fabric between the rollers with the practiced caution of someone who knew what happened when you did not pay attention. A button caught wrong, a seam pulled, and in the worst cases, which happened to everyone eventually and which everyone warned their daughters about, a hand drawn in too close. You were careful. You had always been careful. The laundry came through the wringer flattened and streaming and went into the rinse tub and then through the wringer again, and by the time you were done the pile of wrung laundry in the basket was heavy and cold and smelled of clean water, and you could carry it out to the line with the satisfaction of someone who has done a real thing in the world. There was a whole system to the line, and every woman had her own version of it, and every woman believed her version was the correct one. Sheets on the outside lines, always where the wind was strongest. Shirts hung by their tails to preserve the shoulders. White things together in the sun. Colours away from the direct light so they did not fade. Socks in pairs, pinned at the toe, because unpaired socks were a domestic failure too small to explain to anyone outside of it, but too real to ignore. You moved along the line with your basket on one hip and your clothespins in the pocket of your apron, and the wind that had been cold when you came out of the house began to feel, as the morning warmed, like a collaborator, pushing the wet sheets out into their full shape, doing half the drying before you were even back inside. When the line was full, you stood back and looked at it the way you always did, the whole long row of wet things catching the morning light, each piece hanging in its proper place, the wind moving through them like something satisfied. It was not a dramatic satisfaction. It was not the kind of thing you described to anyone or expected anyone else to notice. It was simply the clean, uncomplicated feeling of a thing done right, of a Monday doing what it was meant to do, of a house being tended by someone who knew how. There is something about carrying a basket of wet laundry out into the backyard on a Monday morning that belongs to a very specific world, a world that moved at the pace of weather and sunlight rather than the pace of convenience. You had your system. Everyone did. Sheets went on the outer line where the wind could get at them. Shirts were hung by the tail so the shoulders did not stretch. Socks went in pairs, always. And you worked quickly because the sky could change, and there was nothing worse than bringing in laundry that had been caught in a sudden afternoon shower and smelled faintly of both soap and rain and defeat. The wooden clothespins clicked in your hand. The wet fabric was heavy and cold. And when the last piece was up and you stood back and looked at the full line lifting in the morning breeze, there was a satisfaction in it that was real and quiet and entirely your own. The clothesline was strung between two wooden posts your husband had set in concrete the summer after you moved in, and it had its own particular geography that you knew as well as you knew anything, where the line sagged slightly in the middle after a heavy load, which post the clothespin bag hung from, how many pieces the line would hold before the centre began to dip too close to the ground. You had added a second line 2 summers ago, when the children were growing and the laundry had grown with them, and now the yard on a Monday morning looked like something from a picture postcard of domestic life. 2 long parallel rows of clean things lifting and falling in the breeze, the whole yard smelling of soap and open air. The neighbours could see your clothesline from their own yards, and you could see theirs, and there was a kind of unspoken Monday conversation that happened across the fences between them, a nod of recognition, a glance that said, "I see you, you see me, we are all doing the same thing on the same morning under the same sky." Mrs. Henderson next door was already at her own line when you came out, and you called good morning across the fence and she called it back, and you worked in companionable parallel for a while, each of you in your own yard, each of you moving down your own line, the shared rhythm of it, a form of conversation that required no words. There were things you knew about weather that you had learned from the line. You knew how the air smelled before rain, not the rain itself, but the particular heaviness that preceded it, the way the breeze would drop and the light would go slightly flat and something in the atmosphere would shift its weight. You knew this because there were consequences to not knowing it. Sheets brought in half dry, or worse, soaked again by an afternoon shower, smelling of wet fabric and requiring another run through the wringer, another afternoon on the line, an entire Monday undone by an hour's inattention to the sky. And so you learned to read it the way you learned everything else about this life, not from a book, but from the doing of it year after year, until the knowledge lived in you rather than simply with you. The drying itself took most of the morning, depending on the wind and the sun, and you checked the line periodically throughout the day the way a farmer checks a field, with the practical, unsentimental attention of someone whose work depends on conditions they cannot control. By midday, if Monday had cooperated, the outer sheets were ready to come in, stiff and sun-warm and smelling of a cleanliness that no dryer has ever fully replicated, a smell that is something between linen and light, between warmth and open air, and that was the smell of a properly conducted Monday in 1953. You folded them at the line rather than carrying them into fold. It was faster. The creases fell in the right places when the fabric was still warm from the sun, and you laid them in the basket with the careful satisfaction of someone returning something to its proper state, clean and ready and whole. The last pieces came in before supper, the cottons and the children's things that had needed the full day, and you folded them on the kitchen table while the dinner was on the stove, the warm fabric passing through your hands with a weight that was entirely different from the cold, wet weight of the morning. This was the end of wash days. You moved through the aisles with your list, but the list was a scaffold rather than a script. You knew what you needed, and you knew what the week required, and you made adjustments as you went. The canned peaches were on sale, so you took 4. The ground beef looked better than usual, so you bought enough for 2 nights instead of 1. You held the bread loaf and pressed gently with your thumb to check for freshness the way your mother had taught you, and you put it back if it was not right. And the stock boy who saw you do this had learned not to say anything because you were always right. You knew your groceries. This was knowledge acquired over years of feeding a family on a budget that had to stretch, and it was as real and as hard won as any professional expertise even if it had no certificate and no salary attached to it. The encounter in the canned goods aisle, or the produce section, or the dairy case, wherever your neighbour happened to appear, was the social core of the Tuesday errand, the part that transformed a chore into something else. You stood with your cart and you talked, really talked, the way people talk when they have time and proximity and the low hum of a grocery store around them, which is to say, without urgency, without agenda, with the easy digressive warmth of people who know each other well enough to move from one subject to another without needing a bridge. You talked about your children and hers, about the new family that had moved into the house on the corner, about the church rummage sale and whether the casserole you brought last year was enough or whether you should bring two this time, about nothing and everything, and the comfortable middle ground between them that is the real substance of a neighbourhood friendship. You left the market with your bags in both arms and your list checked off, and the particular satisfaction of a necessary thing well done. Not just the shopping itself, but the whole of it. The errand a social occasion, the Tuesday as its own kind of good. The bags were heavy, and you did not mind. You knew what was in them, and what it would become over the course of the week, and that knowledge was its own reward, quiet and domestic and entirely sufficient. The grocery list was not simply a list, it was a budget negotiation, a weekly act of quiet mathematics conducted in the privacy of your own head, with the stakes being whether your family ate well and whether the numbers came out right at the end of the month. You knew the price of ground beef to the cent. You knew which brand of canned tomatoes was worth the extra 3 pennies and which was not. You knew how to take a $2 cut of chuck and turn it into a meal that would last 3 nights, and you knew how to do it without making the second or third night feel like leftovers. This kind of domestic economy, careful, skilled, largely invisible, was one of the central competencies of your life, and nobody gave it a name or a title or a salary, but it was real work and you knew it, even if no one else did. The household budget came in an envelope, or in a figure your husband stated at the beginning of the month, and from that figure you were expected to produce everything the family needed: food, household supplies, the children's incidentals, the small domestic replacements that a house required constantly and without announcement, a button lost, a dish broken, a bar of soap that ran out sooner than expected. These were not emergencies, but they were real costs, and they came out of the same fixed amount, and managing them was a form of engineering that no one called engineering because it happened in a kitchen rather than an office. You kept your figures in a small notebook, or in your head if the notebook felt like too much acknowledgement of a problem you preferred to manage privately. You knew, without consulting anything, what you had spent at the market and what was left and what the rest of the week would cost. You knew that the pot roast from Tuesday would serve as dinner on Thursday if you added vegetables and stretched the broth, and that the broth itself could become the base for Friday's soup, and that by the time you reached the end of the week the $2 cut of chuck would have become 4 meals and a stock that you could freeze for later. This was not thrift as deprivation. This was thrift as craft, as intelligence applied to constraint, as a form of creative problem-solving that happened every week quietly in the background of everything else. The pride in it was real even when it was private. You did not advertise your budgeting the way you might advertise a new dress or a successful dinner party, because the budget was not a thing you advertised. It was a thing you managed, and the managing of it was its own reward. But there were moments, usually at the end of a month when the numbers came out right and the family had eaten well and the envelope was not empty, when you felt the specific satisfaction of someone who's done a difficult thing without anyone noticing, which is perhaps the most complete form of competence there is. You had kept the household afloat on a budget that left no margin for error, and you had done it without error, and the family had never known there was anything to manage. What you knew about money and food and the mathematics of a household would have impressed people who worked in offices and called their work analysis. But it did not happen in an office, and it did not have a name, and so it was simply called running the house, which covered everything and credited nothing, and you understood this without bitterness because understanding it was also part of the job. Tuesday afternoon, if the morning had gone well, meant ironing. You set up the board in the living room or the kitchen, whichever had the better light, and you work through the basket with the measured patience of someone who has made peace with the task that requires presence without drama. The iron was heavy, a real cast weight in your hand, and you pressed it along the length of a shirt sleeve with the steady, practiced confidence of someone who knew exactly how much pressure a collar required, how to coax a pleat back into its proper place, how to make a man's white dress shirt look like it had come from a laundry service rather than a basket in the hallway. The radio was on. The afternoon light came through the window at a particular angle. The smell of warm cotton filled the room. And there was something about that smell, clean and pressed and slightly starchy, that was the smell of a house being tended to, of order being quietly restored. The iron itself was a serious instrument. You tested its temperature the way your mother had taught you, with a damp finger held near the sole plate, listening for the hiss that meant it was ready. Too cool and it would leave the fabric looking unconvinced. Too hot and it would scorch, leaving a brown ghost of a mark on the white cotton that no amount of subsequent effort would fully erase, that your husband would notice without saying anything, which was worse than if he had said something. You knew the iron the way you knew all your tools, its particular heat, the way it held temperature through a long session, the way it needed to be set on its heel when you reached for a new piece from the basket, the satisfying weight of it in your hand when it was working right. You started with your husband's shirts, because they were the most demanding, and because you did demanding things first when your attention was fullest. There was a sequence to a shirt and you followed it without thinking. Collar first, then the yoke across the back, then the sleeves, cuffs before the body of the sleeve, always, then the front placket and the button bands, and finally the body itself, front panels and then the back. The iron moving in long, smooth strokes that left the fabric taut and flat, and entirely without wrinkle. You hung each finished shirt on a hanger before it could cool in a fold, because a shirt that cooled in a fold would hold that fold, and all your work would be undone. These were things you knew. These were things your mother had known and her mother before her, passed down not as lessons exactly, but as the accumulated knowledge of women who had done this work so many times, the knowledge had become instinct. The children's things were easier and faster, the girls' dresses with their cotton skirts that took the iron willingly, the boys' trousers that could be done 2 legs at a time if you folded them right, the pinafores and the blouses and the small neat pile of handkerchiefs that your husband carried in his breast pocket, and that you ironed with the same care you gave everything else, because care was not something you rationed by size. You moved through the basket steadily, the pile on the left diminishing, and the row of hung things on the right growing, the afternoon radio filling the room with music or a serial, or the comfortable murmur of whatever program happened to be on, and you listened without quite listening, your attention divided between the iron and the fabric and the particular floating state of mind that ironing produced in you. Not boredom, not quite contentment, but something between them, a kind of occupied calm that was its own form of rest. By the time the basket was empty, the afternoon light had shifted and the room smelled thoroughly of warm, clean cotton and the particular dry heat of a well-used iron, and you stood the iron on its heel to cool and looked at the row of hung things with the satisfaction of someone who has restored order to something that needed it. The shirts were ready for the week. The dresses were ready. The household's presentable surface had been maintained, as it was maintained every week, by hands that knew exactly what they were doing and did it without being asked, and without being thanked, and without particularly requiring either. You unplugged the iron. You folded the board. The afternoon was nearly gone, and dinner needed to start, and you moved toward the kitchen with the particular forward motion of a person whose work is never entirely finished, but who has learned, in the moving between one task and the next, to carry the completion of the last one like a small warmth held close. Wednesday had a different quality than the days around it. Monday was momentum, Tuesday was errands, Thursday was preparation, Friday was reward. But Wednesday sat in the middle of the week with a kind of calm authority, the day that belonged most completely to the house itself. You cleaned on Wednesday, not the surface tidying that happened every morning, but the real cleaning, the kind that got behind things and underneath things and into the corners that no one would ever look at but that you would know about if they were wrong. You ran the carpet sweeper through every room. You wiped down the kitchen cabinets. You polished the furniture with lemon oil until the whole house smelled like a fresh start, and you straightened every cushion and every picture frame with the quiet satisfaction of someone setting a stage that no audience would ever consciously notice, but everyone would feel. You began at the top of the house and worked your way down, the way you'd been taught, because dirt and dust followed gravity and it made no sense to clean a floor before you had finished with the surfaces above it. The upstairs bedrooms first, stripping the beds if it was not wash day, which on Wednesday it was not, but checking the linens and remaking everything with the particular tightness of corners that your mother had taught you and that you had never been able to do carelessly since. Hospital corners, always. It was one of those standards you held not because anyone would check, but because the standard itself was the point. The private discipline of doing a thing correctly when no one was watching being the only discipline that genuinely counted. Then the bathroom, which required a different kind of attention, the sink and the tub scrubbed with cleanser until they held no memory of the week's use, the mirror wiped with a cloth dampened with vinegar water until it showed you a face with no smears, the floor mopped on your hands and knees because a mop never got the corners properly and you knew it. The bathroom on a Wednesday afternoon smelled of cleanser and something faintly medicinal and entirely, unmistakably clean, and when your children came home from school and used it and came back out again, they did not notice. They never noticed. That was, in its way, the whole point. Downstairs was the longest part. The living room with its furniture to be moved and dusted under, its rug to be swept in overlapping strokes until the pile stood up the way it was meant to. The kitchen to be gone over properly, the stovetop lifted and cleaned beneath, the icebox wiped inside and out, the baseboards that collected a week's worth of kitchen debris attended to with a damp cloth, and a patience that was simply part of the job. You moved through it all with the steady, unhurried efficiency of someone who has done this so many times. The house and the cleaning of it have become a single continuous thing, each room yielding to your attention and giving back its better self. The whole house by mid-afternoon smelling of lemon oil and cleanser, and the particular clean airiness of windows opened to let the Wednesday through. When it was done, you stood in the centre of the living room for a moment, the way you always did, and you looked at what the morning's work had made. The cushions were straight. The furniture gleamed softly in the afternoon light. The floors were clear and the rugs were even, and every surface held itself with the quiet dignity of something that had been properly cared for. Nobody would walk in and say anything. That was fine. You knew what it had looked like before you started, and you knew what it looked like now, and the distance between those two things was the measure of the morning, and it was enough. Somewhere in the middle of the Wednesday cleaning, or just after it was done, came the baking. Not necessarily a grand project, perhaps just a batch of oatmeal cookies for the children after school, or a coffee cake for the neighbour who'd been unwell, or a pie because the week had been long and your family deserved something warm from the oven. You made it from memory, the way your mother had made it, the way her mother had made it before that, measuring flour by the feel of it in your hand, knowing by the smell of the butter browning whether the heat was right, knowing by the way the dough pulled away from the bowl whether it needed another minute or another tablespoon of milk. The kitchen filled with warmth and the particular golden buttery smell of something becoming, and if your children came home from school to find a plate of cookies cooling on a rack by the window, they walked into that smell the way you walk into an embrace. You did not use a recipe the way a person uses a map, consulting it at every turn to confirm they are still on course. You used it the way an experienced traveller uses a map, glancing at it occasionally to confirm what you already mostly knew, trusting your own accumulated knowledge of the terrain more than the printed directions. The recipe card was there, written in your own handwriting or your mother's, stained at the edges from years of flour-dusted fingers, its measurements slightly smudged where the vanilla had dripped one afternoon years ago, and you had blotted it and kept going. You knew that card the way you knew the house. You did not need to read it so much as consult it, the way you might consult a friend whose opinion you already know, but whose company you value anyway. The bowl was the large ceramic one, the cream-coloured one with the blue stripe around the rim that had been a wedding gift, and that you had used so many times it had become as familiar as your own hands. You creamed the butter and the sugar together until the mixture went pale and light, and the kitchen filled with the smell of something sweet beginning, and you worked the flour in by feel, a little at a time, the way you had always done it. There was a point in the making of anything baked when the dough or the batter crossed over from its separate ingredients into something unified, something that had become its own thing, and you could feel that moment in your hands before you could see it in the bowl, the resistance changing, the texture settling into itself, and that moment was one of the small reliable pleasures of a Wednesday afternoon. The oven had its own personality, as all ovens did. Yours ran slightly cool on the left side, and you accounted for it automatically, rotating the pan halfway through so that nothing came out unevenly browned. You had learned this the hard way, early in your marriage, a pan of burned cookies on the left and pale ones on the right being the kind of lesson that teaches itself thoroughly and once. Now you did it without thinking, the rotation as natural as breathing, another piece of knowledge that lived in your hands rather than your head. When the cookies came out, or the cake, or the pie, whatever the Wednesday had called for, you set them on the rack by the window, and the smell that rose from them was something that belonged entirely to this life, and this era, warm and sweet and domestic in the most genuine sense of that word. The smell of a house being actively inhabited by someone who cared what it felt like to live in it. Your children would come through the door in an hour and they would smell it before they saw it, and their faces would do the thing that faces do when something good is waiting. That involuntary softening that is the body's honest response to being cared for. You would not make a production of it. You would simply set the plate on the table and let them have their cookies, and the Wednesday would have done in that small moment exactly what a Wednesday was for. Lunch during the week was, for most housewives, a quiet and solitary thing. Your husband was at work, your children were at school, and so you ate alone, at the kitchen table, with the radio on, and the morning's work behind you, and the afternoon's work still ahead. It was not a sad solitude most days. It was simply your own. You made something simple, a bowl of tomato soup from the can, heated in the pot you had not yet put away from the morning. A sandwich on white bread with the crusts cut off, because that was how you liked it, and there was no one there to give the crusts to. A glass of milk or a second cup of coffee, and you sat for a few minutes and you listened to the radio, and you were, in the most ordinary and complete sense of the word, off duty, briefly, quietly, entirely yourself. The radio at lunchtime had its own particular programming, different from the morning shows and different again from the evening ones, and you had your preferences the way you had preferences about everything in your day, quietly, without making a fuss about them, but genuinely and specifically. There was a serial you followed, or a cooking program whose host you found either instructive or mildly irritating depending on the day, or simply the music that the midday station played, the kind of easy orchestral arrangements that asked nothing of you except to let them fill the room. You did not always listen closely. Sometimes the radio was simply company, a voice in the kitchen that kept the silence from becoming too complete, that gave the room a texture of occupation even when you were the only one in it. You ate slowly, which was unusual. Every other meal of your day was conducted at the pace of other people's needs. Breakfast time to your husband's departure, dinner time to his return, snacks time to the children coming home from school. Lunch belonged to no one's schedule but your own, and you had learned, over the years, to take that seriously. You sat with your soup and your sandwich and you did not rush. You looked out the kitchen window at the yard, or you read the back of a cereal box that had been left on the table, or you simply sat with your own thoughts in the particular way that is only possible when no one is about to ask you anything. There was something the women's magazines of that era never quite captured about the midday hour, which is that it was not empty so much as open. The morning had been full, the family sent out, the laundry managed, the marketing done or the ironing completed, the house brought back to itself after the morning's disruption. The afternoon would be full again, dinner to plan and begin, children to receive when they came home, whatever the day's second half required. But lunch sat between those two fullnesses like a breath held gently, and the women who learned to inhabit it rather than simply pass through it were the ones who came to the afternoon with something still intact. Your soup bowl went into the sink and you rinsed it without drama and set it to dry. The bread bag was twisted closed and returned to its place. The kitchen was restored to its midday order in the time it took to do those two small things, and you stood at the sink for a moment and looked out the window at whatever the afternoon had made of the backyard, the light different now than it had been in the morning. These shadows shifted, the garden doing its quiet afternoon business of simply growing. There was a neighbour's cat that sometimes appeared on the fence at this hour, and regarded the yard with the serene indifference of a creature that had no schedule and knew it. You dried your hands on the dish towel and turned back toward the kitchen, and the afternoon opened up in front of you with its particular quality of possibility and obligation combined. Things that needed doing, yes, but also the sense that the day was still in motion, still offering something, still yours to move through rather than simply endure. The radio played on for another few minutes while you thought about what came next, your hands already beginning to organize themselves toward the next task before your mind had quite caught up, the body's domestic intelligence operating just slightly ahead of conscious thought, the way it always did by Wednesday afternoon when the week had found its rhythm. Lunch was over. It had been enough. It had been, in its small and unremarkable way, entirely what it needed to be. A pause that restored rather than depleted. A solitude that refreshed rather than hollowed. A meal that asked nothing of you except that you sit down and eat it. You had, and now the afternoon was waiting, patient and familiar, and you went to meet it the way you went to meet everything in this life, without ceremony, without complaint, with the quiet forward motion of someone who understands that the day does not stop for anyone, but who has also learned, somewhere along the way, to take their lunch. By Thursday, the week had a forward lean to it. You could feel the weekend approaching the way you can feel a weather change. Something in the air, a shift in the light, the small private anticipation of 2 days when the rhythm would be different. Thursday was the day you got ahead. You planned the weekend meals and wrote the list for anything you had missed at Tuesday's market. You changed the bed linens and put them through the wash. You made sure the bathrooms were properly done, not the weekly surface clean but the real one, the kind that involved a scrub brush and an elbow, and the faint chemical smell of cleanser that meant the porcelain was genuinely clean. You were building towards something, and the building itself was satisfying, the way preparation always is when you're good at it and you know it. Thursday had a quality of consolidation that the earlier days did not. Monday and Tuesday were about meeting the week's demands as they arrived. Wednesday was about the house itself, but Thursday was about foresight, about looking ahead to what the next 2 days would require and making sure that when they arrived, they found everything ready. This was a form of thinking that ran continuously in the background of your week, a low hum of planning that most people in your household were entirely unaware of and that you never discussed, because discussing it would have required explaining it, and explaining it would have required someone to sit still long enough to understand what a week actually involved, and by Thursday you did not have time for that. The bed linens came off in the morning, bundled and sorted with the efficient speed of someone who has done this so many times. Her hands work independently of the rest of her. Thursday's wash was lighter than Monday's, linens and towels rather than the full week's clothing, and it went through the ringer faster and onto the line in less time, and by the time you came back inside the morning was still mostly ahead of you, which was exactly the point. You wanted Thursday to feel like room rather than constraint, like a day that had space in it for the extra things, the small anticipations, the forward preparations that would make the weekend feel less like something that had happened to you and more like something you had made. You went through the house in the late morning with the particular attention of someone checking their own work, not cleaning so much as confirming, making sure that Wednesday's effort had held, that the room still had the quality of order you had given them the day before. A pillow straightened here, a window cracked an inch to let the Thursday air through. The kitchen assessed for what it would need over the next 4 days. Was there enough flour, enough sugar, enough of the staples that a weekend of cooking would draw down? You made notes in your head, or on the small pad by the telephone, and those notes would become Saturday morning's market list if anything had been missed on Tuesday. By afternoon, Thursday had given you what you'd asked of it, a house in good order, a week in hand, a weekend that would arrive to find things ready. You stood at the kitchen counter in the late afternoon light and felt, without naming it, the particular satisfaction of a competent person who has stayed ahead of what was coming. The children would be home soon. Dinner needed to start. The week was not finished, but it was in hand, and in hand was enough. Dinner was the measure of the day, the moment when everything you had been quietly managing became visible in the form of a hot meal on a set table. You did not simply cook dinner, you orchestrated it, timing the roast and the potatoes and the vegetables so that everything arrived ready at once, so that nothing sat and went cold while something else finished, so that when your husband came through the door and your children came in from the yard, the food was warm and the table was set and the whole domestic machine had arrived, on cue, at this moment. The house smelled of whatever was in the oven, and that smell was the unofficial signal that the day was ending, that everyone was home, that something good was waiting. It is the kind of smell that people who grew up in those houses still carry with them, somewhere in the back of their memory, long after the houses themselves are gone. You started dinner earlier than people might expect, because a proper weeknight meal in the 1950s was not something you assembled in 30 minutes. The pot roast had been in the oven since mid-afternoon, low and slow, the fat rendering into the pan and mixing with the vegetables you had laid around it, carrots cut on the diagonal, potatoes halved, an onion quartered and placed where it would soften completely into the braising liquid and give itself over entirely to the flavour of the thing. The smell that rose from it as the afternoon progressed was one of the primary sensory facts of your household, the smell that your children would later associate, without knowing they were associating anything, with the feeling of being home. The table was set before your husband arrived. Always. This was not a rule anyone had written down, but it was as fixed as any written rule. 4 places, the good plates on weeknights rather than the everyday ones, because you believed a family dinner deserved better than the everyday ones. The glasses filled with water, the salt and pepper in their proper places, the butter dish on its little plate. You set the table the way you did everything, with care, with the understanding that the details mattered even when no one remarked on them, perhaps especially then. A table set properly before anyone sat down to it was a form of welcome, a way of saying before anyone arrived that they were expected, and that their arrival was worth preparing for. Your husband came through the door at the same time he always came through the door, and the children drifted in from wherever they had been, and the family assembled around the table with the unremarkable ease of people who have sat down together so many times the arrangement is simply gravity. Your husband said something about the day. Your children said something about school. You moved between the stove and the table for the last few minutes, the gravy finished and poured, the bread sliced and brought to the table in the bread basket, the whole meal arriving in its proper order. Then you sat down. And for the length of a Thursday dinner, the house was exactly what it was supposed to be, full, warm, fed, and together. Friday had a looseness to it that the other days did not. The week's hard work was behind you. The weekend was ahead, and there was a collective exhale across every household in the neighbourhood that you could almost feel through the walls. Your husband came home in a better mood. Your children came in from school already vibrating with the particular energy of 2 days of freedom stretching out in front of them. You made something easier for dinner, maybe soup and sandwiches, maybe a tuna casserole that could go in the oven and mostly take care of itself, because by Friday you had earned the right to a meal that did not require your full attention. And after the dishes were done and the children were in bed, you and your husband sat in the living room with the television on or the radio playing, and the week settled around you like a coat you were finally able to take off. Friday morning felt different from the first moment you were awake. The alarm was the same alarm. The kitchen was the same kitchen. The percolator made the same sound it made every morning of the week. But something in the quality of the day announced itself early, a kind of atmospheric loosening that was almost physical, the way a held breath releases not all at once but gradually, beginning somewhere in the chest and working outward. You noticed it in yourself, and you noticed it in your children, who came downstairs on Friday mornings with the lightness that Monday mornings categorically refused to provide. Even your husband's departure had a different quality on Fridays, something in his posture slightly less braced against the day, something in his goodbye slightly warmer, the week's accumulated weight not quite so visible in the set of his shoulders. You moved through the Friday morning at a pace that was not slower exactly but less pressured. the way a river moves when the banks widen. The tidying was done, but without the Monday urgency. The marketing was already behind you, the laundry managed, the ironing finished, the house cleaned. Friday morning was maintenance rather than effort. Surfaces wiped, rooms straightened, the kitchen set in order, and maintenance, after a full week of real work, felt almost like rest. You had a second cup of coffee at mid-morning and you drank it sitting down, which was not something you did on Mondays or Tuesdays or Wednesdays, and the sitting down itself was a small declaration that the week had been met, and the meeting of it had gone well enough. The children came home in the afternoon already changed by the weekend's proximity, their school week shed at the door with their book bags, their voices louder and their movements more expansive in the particular way of children who no longer have anywhere to be by any particular time. They wanted a snack and then they wanted outside, and you gave them both, and then the house was quieter again, and you stood in the kitchen in the late Friday afternoon and felt the day settling into its final hours with the particular grace of a thing that has been well used and is now winding down. Dinner was easy and good, and nobody complained, and your husband poured himself a glass of something after, and the evening arranged itself around the two of you in the living room with the comfortable familiarity of people who have spent enough Friday evenings together that the pattern of it is its own kind of pleasure. The television murmured. The week was behind you. The weekend had not yet made any demands, and for a few hours in that quiet living room everything was simply enough. Leisure in the 1950s was not the frantic, screen-lit, option-saturated thing it has become. It was quieter than that, and in some ways richer. Friday night, if there was no social obligation, meant the television in the living room, your husband in his chair and you on the sofa with your mending basket, because even leisure had its productive edges, and whatever programme happened to be on. Maybe it was a comedy, maybe it was a variety show. The picture was small and the reception was sometimes unreliable. The image going to snow and then returning, and nobody thought much of it. The room was warm and the lamp was on, and outside the neighbourhood was doing the same thing. All those lit windows and quiet houses, the whole street suspended in a kind of Friday evening peace that felt earned and ordinary and entirely sufficient. Your mending basket sat beside you on the sofa with the comfortable familiarity of a companion who's been present at enough Friday evenings to be taken for granted, and this was not a criticism. The mending was not work exactly, not on Friday nights. It was something to do with your hands while the rest of you rested, a way of being occupied without being required, the needle moving through the fabric in small steady stitches while your attention was mostly elsewhere, on the screen, on whatever your husband said occasionally from his chair, on the comfortable ambient sounds of a house at rest, a button resewn, a hem turned back up and caught, a small tear in a shirt pocket closed so neatly it would never announce itself. These were the tiny repairs that kept a household's surfaces intact, the invisible maintenance work that existed below the level of anyone's notice and above the level of anything being genuinely wrong. Your husband's chair was his in the way that things become yours through long and uncontested occupation. He had sat in it every Friday evening for years, and the chair had accommodated itself to him in the way that good furniture does, the cushion shaped to his particular weight and posture, the armrests worn smooth at the places his arms rested. He watched the television with the relaxed attention of a man whose week was genuinely behind him, occasionally commenting on what was on the screen or on something that had happened at work that week, a story he had been saving for a moment when there was time to tell it properly. You listened and responded, and the conversation had the easy, undemanding quality of two people who know each other well enough that they do not need to perform interest, because the interest is simply there, habitual and real. The programs themselves were a shared experience in a way that entertainment has not quite been since. There were only so many channels, which meant that on any given Friday evening most of the street was watching more or less the same thing, and this created a kind of collective narrative that ran through the neighbourhood. You could reference what had happened on a program at the Tuesday market, and your neighbour would know exactly what you meant. And this shared currency of weekly stories was part of the fabric of a community in a way that is difficult to replicate when everyone is watching something different in a separate room. You laughed at the same jokes, you followed the same serials. The television, small and occasionally snowy and entirely sufficient, was a communal experience dressed up as a domestic one. By 10 o'clock the mending basket was set aside, and the television was turned off, and the house was ready for the night, and you moved through the last small rituals of a Friday, the kitchen checked, the back door locked, the children's rooms looked in on, the lights turned off one by one until only the bedroom lamp remained. You climbed into bed with the particular heaviness of a person whose week had been genuinely full, and the week released you, the way a long-held note finally releases its breath, and Friday night became Saturday morning in the quiet dark of a house that had earned its rest. Saturday morning had its own particular quality of noise, the house suddenly full of everyone at once, no one needing to be anywhere by any specific time, the whole day stretching out with an openness that felt almost luxurious by comparison to the scheduled week. Your husband might cut the grass, your children might disappear into the backyard or down the street to wherever the neighbourhood children gathered, and you might not see them again until someone was hungry. You had your own Saturday routine, a deeper version of the weekly cleaning, the things that only got done once a week, the windows wiped down, the refrigerator sorted, the pantry straightened. But there was a different quality to the work. The house was full. The back door kept opening and closing. Someone was always asking for something, and for some reason that was fine. The difference between Saturday morning and every other morning of the week was the quality of the interruptions. On weekdays, the interruptions had urgency attached to them. A child about to miss the bus, a husband looking for his hat, a crisis with a 10-minute deadline. Saturday's interruptions were different. They were leisurely, almost recreational. Your youngest appeared in the kitchen doorway wanting to know if she could have a friend over. Your middle one wanted to know where his baseball glove was. Your husband came in from the yard wanting to know if you had seen the Clippers, and then stayed to drink a second cup of coffee leaning against the counter, talking about what he was going to do to the garden this spring, the conversation going nowhere in particular, and taking as long as it liked. These were the interruptions of a day that had no agenda, and you moved around them with a patience that Monday mornings genuinely could not have supported. You started with the windows, because the windows were the thing you felt most clearly on a Saturday morning, the difference between the week's glass and the weekend's light. You mixed your vinegar water in the bucket and worked your way through each room with your cloth, the glass going clear and streak-free under your hand, the Saturday morning coming through it with a brightness that felt like an accomplishment, even though it was only a window. There was a simplicity to window cleaning that you'd always found slightly meditative. The circular motion, the immediate visible result, the way a room changed character when its glass was properly clear. You could see the neighbour's maple from the living room window, and on a Saturday morning with the glass clean and the light coming through it, that tree looked like something worth looking at. The refrigerator came next, emptied shelf by shelf, wiped down inside, restocked in proper order, anything past its usefulness removed without sentiment. You were not sentimental about food. You were practical, which is a different and more useful thing, and the refrigerator after a Saturday morning's attention was a small model of domestic order. Everything in its place, everything accounted for, the week's remaining provisions organized in a way that told you at a glance what was there and what would need to be replaced. You made your Saturday marketing list from what you saw, adding items with the efficiency of someone who has been doing this long enough to know exactly what a family of 4 goes through in a week and exactly what it will need for the one coming. By mid-morning, the house was in the kind of order that a full weekend required, the kind that could absorb children in and out and a husband tracking grass clippings through the kitchen and still hold its shape through Sunday dinner. You stood in the kitchen with your coffee and the back door open to the yard and listened to the Saturday sounds. The lawnmower 2 houses down, your children's voices from somewhere out of sight, a car radio passing slowly on the street, and felt the particular satisfaction of a house that was working the way a house was supposed to work, full and open and ready for whatever the weekend decided to bring. Saturday errands had a companionable quality that the Tuesday grocery run, however social, did not quite match. On Saturday you were not alone. Your husband might drive or you might walk, and the children might come or might not, and the town's commercial street was full of everyone who'd been waiting all week for a Saturday. You stopped at the hardware store where the smell of metal and sawdust and machine oil hit you when you opened the door, and the man behind the counter knew your husband's name. You might stop at the 5 and dime where the aisle smelled of something between candy and rubber and newness, and where your children could spend 15 minutes deciding how to spend a dime with a seriousness that suggested they were negotiating world peace. And the drive home, if you drove, had that particular Saturday afternoon quality of a week fully used, an afternoon still ahead, and nothing urgent waiting. The hardware store was your husband's territory, and you knew it, and he knew it, and this was fine. You walked through it the way you walk through someone else's kitchen, curious, respectful, aware that the geography was not yours to organize, but interesting nonetheless. The bins of screws and bolts, and the things whose names you did not know, but whose purposes you could infer. The smell of linseed oil, and the particular dry dustiness of lumber stacked in the back. The way the men at the counter talked to your husband in the shorthand of people who shared a technical vocabulary you did not possess and did not need to possess, and the way your husband's voice changed slightly in that conversation, becoming more precise, more specific, more interested in a way that work had not quite managed to make him this week. You let him have it. Everyone needed a place where they knew what they were doing. The 5 and dime was different. It was everyone's territory, the democratic emporium of small wants and modest budgets, the store that sold everything in small quantities and asked very little of anyone. You picked up a spool of thread in a colour you'd been meaning to replace. Your daughter found a hair ribbon she wanted and held it up for your consideration, with the absolute sincerity of someone for whom this ribbon was the most important decision currently before her. Your son drifted toward the toy aisle, and you let him drift because there was no hurry, and the toy aisle in a 1950s 5 and dime was a genuinely good place to be. The balsa wood gliders and the cap guns and the puzzles and the small cardboard boxes of things that cost a nickel and promised entertainment the packaging could never quite deliver, but which your son would buy with perfect faith anyway, because he was 8, and that was how 8 worked. You paid for your thread and your daughter's ribbon at the counter, where the woman knew your name and asked after your mother, and you told her, and asked after her sister, and the exchange took 4 minutes and was entirely genuine, and then you gathered your children, and your husband materialized from the direction of the plumbing supplies with a small paper bag of whatever had required the trip, and you went back out into the Saturday afternoon together. The drive home was quiet in the good way, the children subdued by their purchases, your husband content, the town falling away behind you and your own street appearing ahead, familiar and sufficient, the whole errand accomplished and the afternoon still open ahead of you, like a door into something unhurried and good. The hours between 2 and 5 on a Saturday afternoon were some of the softest in the week. The morning's work was done. The evening's social obligation, if there was one, had not yet begun. The light was long and golden, and the neighbourhood had a drowsy, sunlit quality. A lawn mower running somewhere in the distance, a radio on a neighbour's porch, children's voices rising and falling like birds. You might sit in the backyard with a glass of iced tea and the newspaper. You might work in the garden, on your knees in the dirt with your gloves on, and the smell of soil and green things around you. You might do nothing in particular, which was itself a kind of skill, the ability to be still in a Saturday afternoon without the restless sense that you were forgetting something, without reaching for something to fill the space. Some people called it rest. You called it enough. The garden, if you had one, was a Saturday afternoon occupation that was its own form of meditative labour, slower than housework, more seasonal, requiring a different kind of attention that was less about efficiency and more about patience. You knelt in the dirt and you pulled the weeds that had appeared since last Saturday, with the philosophical acceptance of someone who understood that weeds were simply the garden's opinion of what should grow there, an opinion you had been quietly overruling for years. The soil was warm on a May Saturday, or cool on an October one, and either way it smelled of something deep and alive and entirely removed from the domestic interior of the week you had just lived through. The garden was the one place in your life where the work was openly, visibly biological. Things growing, things dying, things needing water and attention, and the willingness to get your hands dirty in a way that kitchens and parlours categorically did not permit. Your children played around you, or did not, depending on the afternoon and their mood, and whatever complicated social arrangements were currently governing the neighbourhood children's collective activity. Sometimes your youngest sat beside you in the dirt and asked questions about what you were doing, with the sincere curiosity of someone for whom the world is still primarily a source of information rather than demands. You answered them as carefully as the questions deserved, which was carefully because a child asking about why roses needed to be pruned was asking about something real, and your answer would go somewhere in her and stay there. These were the conversations that happened sideways, while your hands were in the dirt and the afternoon sun was on your back, and they were often the best ones. By 4 o'clock the light had shifted toward its late afternoon softness, and the temperature had eased, and the neighbourhood was beginning its slow Saturday pivot toward evening, smells of dinner starting to drift from open windows, children being called in from yards, the particular quality of a Saturday at the hour when it has given most of what it had to give and is beginning to gather itself toward the evening. You pulled off your garden gloves and brushed the dirt from your knees, and stood up in the way that bodies stand up after a long time close to the ground, slowly, with a brief awareness of the afternoon's accumulated posture, and you looked at what the garden had become under your hands this afternoon, and it was better than it had been, and that was the whole point and entirely enough, and you went inside to wash your hands and think about what the evening would need. If Saturday night meant going out, and often it did, a dinner with another couple, a church social, a card night at a neighbour's house, then the late afternoon involved a transformation you undertook with a certain quiet pleasure. You ran a bath, you set your hair, You pressed the dress you'd been saving for a week of Saturdays in your mind, the one that was just right for wherever you were going. Getting dressed for Saturday night was its own ritual, one that was not about vanity exactly, but about something more like ceremony, the acknowledgement that the week had a culmination, that there was a version of yourself that existed apart from the house and the work, a version that wore red lipstick and good earrings and knew how to make conversation in a room full of people and come home feeling like herself, maybe more so. The bath was drawn with the deliberate care of someone who intended to use it properly rather than simply get clean. The water was hot enough to feel like an event. You stayed in it longer than the week's rushed morning showers had permitted you to stay anywhere, and the bathroom filled with steam and the smell of the bath salts you used only on Saturday evenings, because they were the good ones, kept in a glass jar on the shelf above the tub, and the using of them was a private Saturday luxury that nobody knew about because nobody needed to. You lay in the hot water and the week uncoiled from your shoulders and your neck and the backs of your legs with the slow and grateful release of a body that had been working since Monday and had not until this moment been properly thanked. Your hair was set in rollers after the bath, and you sat at the vanity in your slip with a towel around your shoulders and did your face with the particular absorbed attention of a woman who is preparing to be seen. This was not performance, or not only performance, it was also pleasure, the pleasure of the vanity itself, the small tubes and compacts and the mirror lit warmly by the bedroom lamp, the ritual of foundation and powder, and the careful arc of an eyebrow pencil, the lipstick chosen and applied and pressed against a square of tissue and considered and decided on. You'd been doing this long enough that the motions were practiced and the result reliable, but there was still, on Saturday evenings, a small ceremony in the doing of it, a sense of marking the transition from the week's version of yourself to the one that went out into a room and was present in it. The dress came last. You had thought about it since Thursday, the way you thought about most things a day or two before you needed them. Not obsessively, just practically, letting the decision settle in the background until it was ready. You stepped into it and reached back for the zipper with the particular contortion that women of that era performed so automatically it had become a kind of signature gesture, and the dress settled onto your shoulders and you turned to the mirror and saw the Saturday night version of yourself looking back, rested, dressed, present, a person with somewhere to go and someone to be when she got there. Your husband appeared in the doorway in his good suit with his hair combed, and you looked at each other the way people look at each other when they've been together long enough that the looking is easy, and what they see is still good, and then you picked up your purse and went out into the Saturday evening together. If you were the one hosting the card night, and you rotated that responsibility among 4 or 5 couples throughout the month, then Saturday also meant the particular anxious pleasure of having your home on display. You had set out the good dishes. You'd made the finger sandwiches and the cocktail nuts and the little cream cheese rolls that everyone always asked for, but that you pretended took no effort. Your husband had arranged the card tables in the living room, and the ashtrays were emptied and positioned, and by the time the doorbell first rang, the house was exactly what you'd intended it to be. Welcoming, comfortable, a little festive, smelling of coffee and something sweet from the kitchen. And then everyone arrived and the cards were dealt and the room filled up with voices and laughter and the comfortable argument of people who had known each other long enough to be honest. And you sat at your table and played your hand and felt, without needing to name it, the particular warmth of belonging to a place and a set of people and a life that was genuinely yours. The preparation for a card night began earlier in the day than anyone who arrived at 8 o'clock would ever have guessed, because the ease of a well-hosted evening is produced by invisible labour, and the invisibility of it is precisely the point. The cream cheese rolls had been made in the afternoon, and were wrapped in waxed paper in the refrigerator. The cocktail nuts were in the good bowl, the one that came out only for company, placed on the side table where people would find them without being directed to them. The coffee was ready to percolate at the moment the evening called for it, which you would judge by the room rather than the clock. You had learned to host the way you had learned everything else in this life, by paying close attention to what made people comfortable, and then producing those conditions so smoothly that comfort seemed to simply be the nature of your home, rather than the result of anyone's deliberate effort. The card tables were your husband's domain, and he had set them up in the living room with the same methodical care he brought to anything mechanical. The legs unfolded and locked, the felt tops brushed, the chairs positioned at the right distance from the table for people to sit comfortably without feeling crowded. You had put out the good card decks, not the frayed everyday ones, and the score pads and the sharpened pencils, and the whole arrangement had the clean, purposeful look of something ready to be used well. When the first couple arrived and came through the door into the warm-lit room and said what it looked wonderful, the compliment was genuine, and you received it with the particular mixture of pleasure and practiced modesty that was the correct register for such things, which is to say, you thanked them and offered them something to eat, and let the evening begin. Cards were played and scores were kept, and the room grew warmer and louder as the evening progressed, the kind of noise that is generated by people who are genuinely enjoying themselves rather than performing enjoyment, which is a different noise entirely and one that a good host could distinguish immediately. The conversation moved between the game and away from it in the natural way of evenings, among people who have things to say to each other. The neighbourhood news, the children's doings, the small controversies and comedies of a shared community life. The kind of talk that felt trivial in the moment, and that was the actual substance of friendship. You played your hand and listened and contributed and refilled coffee cups and brought out the cream cheese rolls at the moment the evening needed them, and by the time the last couple put on their coats and said their good nights at the door, the room held the warm, slightly dishevelled evidence of an evening well spent. The score pads covered in numbers, the nut bowl empty, the ashtrays requiring their attention, the card tables bearing the comfortable disorder of a game played through to its conclusion. You stood in the doorway and watched the last car pull away, and then closed the door on the Saturday night, and the house settled around you with the particular quietness of a space that has been full of life, and is now contentedly returning to itself. Sunday morning in a 1950s household had a quality you could almost taste. There was a slowness to it that the other mornings did not allow, a permission built into the day itself to move at the pace of something rather than towards something. You got up, but not urgently. You started coffee, but you did not rush it. The children slept later than usual or lay in bed reading or came downstairs in their pyjamas and sat at the table with their cereal and their contentment. Your husband read the newspaper. The house was warm and unhurried, and the Sunday smell was already building. Coffee and newsprint and whatever was beginning to suggest itself in the back of your mind for the afternoon, the pot roast or the chicken, the thing that would take hours and would fill the whole house with its presence long before it was ready to be eaten. The Sunday morning light was different from the light of other mornings, and you had always known this without ever quite articulating it. It came through the curtains at the same angle it came through on Saturdays, but it felt less purposeful somehow, less insistent, more like an invitation than a directive. You lay in bed for a few extra minutes and let it come in, and did not feel the familiar pull toward the kitchen, and the percolator, and the list of things the morning required. Because on Sunday, the morning required very little, and the very little it required could wait. This was a gift the week gave you once, and only once, and you had learned over the years to receive it properly, not guiltily, not anxiously, but with the full and uncomplicated acceptance it deserved. When you came downstairs, the kitchen was quieter than on weekdays, and the quiet was of a different kind, not the pre-dawn solitude of a Monday morning claimed by effort and early rising, but the easy, unhurried quiet of a house that was genuinely resting. You filled the percolator without rushing. You looked out the window at the backyard in the Sunday morning light, the garden, the clothesline post standing empty, the oak tree your children climbed in summer throwing its shadow across the grass at the particular angle that meant it was still early and the day had not yet committed itself to anything. A robin was working at something near the garden bed. A car passed distantly on the main road, its sound softened by the Sunday air. The neighbourhood was still mostly asleep, or still mostly quiet, which amounted to the same thing. Your husband came downstairs with his hair uncombed, which was something that only happened on Sundays, and he poured his coffee and took his newspaper to the table, and sat with the particular settled quality of a man who knew that nothing was going to interrupt him for a while. You sat across from him with your own cup and the comfortable silence of two people who had long since passed the point of needing to fill every quiet moment with conversation. He read. You looked out the window. The percolator ticked as it cooled. Somewhere upstairs a child's footstep moved across the floor and then stopped, and then there was the sound of a book being opened, and then silence again. The children came down in their own time, in their pyjamas, their hair pressed flat on one side from sleeping, their eyes still carrying the particular softness of people recently returned from wherever sleep takes you. You made them their cereal or their toast without any of the weekday urgency that accompanied the same task on Monday through Friday, setting the bowls down in front of them with a Sunday morning ease that they absorbed without knowing they were absorbing it. They sat at the table and ate without hurry, and your youngest looked out the window at the robin still working in the garden bed and asked what it was doing, and you told her, and that small exchange, the question and the answer, the child and the bird and the Sunday morning window, was the kind of moment that would not be remembered specifically, but would become part of the general texture of childhood, the feeling of Sunday mornings as a place rather than a time, warm and unhurried and entirely safe. By mid-morning the smell of the pot roast was beginning its long, slow announcement from the oven, and the Sunday had found its shape, your husband still with his newspaper, the children drifted toward their various Sunday morning occupations, the kitchen holding its particular combination of coffee and roasting meat, and the faint sweetness of the bread you had set out for breakfast. The day had asked very little of you so far, and what it had asked had been easy to give, and there was still the whole afternoon ahead, the church and the dinner and the long golden hours after, and none of it felt like obligation, so much as the comfortable structure of a life that knew what Sundays were for. You refilled your cup and sat back down at the table and looked at nothing in particular, and felt, in the most uncomplicated way, at home. Getting 5 people washed and dressed and in the car by 9:45 on a Sunday morning required a precision that military operations would have recognised. Your husband's suit had been brushed the night before. Your children's good clothes were laid out on their beds. Your own dress, hat, gloves and shoes had been decided days earlier, because the mental load of deciding them on Sunday morning itself was a luxury you could not afford. You moved through the house like a conductor before the performance, a button fastened here, a cowlick smoothed there, a small crisis averted when someone could not find their left shoe, and you did it with enough calm that by the time you all walked out the front door and down the porch steps into the Sunday morning light, You looked exactly like what the neighbourhood expected to see. A family setting out together, orderly and whole. The preparation had begun, in a certain sense, on Saturday night. You had laid out each child's clothes in the specific order they would be put on. Undergarments, then dress or trousers, then the good socks that were kept separate from the everyday ones, then the shoes set side by side at the foot of the bed like small sentinels awaiting their assignment. This arrangement was not fussiness. It was engineering. A Sunday morning with 5 people and 1 bathroom and a 9:45 departure time left no margin for the kind of searching and deciding that weekday mornings could sometimes absorb. On Sunday, everything needed to be ready before the morning started, because the morning itself was not long enough to also be a preparation. Your husband dressed himself, which was one of the Sunday morning's reliable mercies. He came downstairs in his good suit with his tie knotted and his shoes shined and his hair combed, and you straightened his tie once, briefly, by habit and by the faint pleasure of the gesture, and he submitted to it with the comfortable patience of a man who'd been having his tie straightened by her for long enough that the act was simply part of getting dressed. He then retreated to his newspaper for the remaining minutes before departure, which was fine, because what the remaining minutes required was not his help, but his absence from the bathroom. The children were the variable. Your oldest could be trusted to dress herself and appear at the appointed time looking correct, which she did, punctual and pressed and faintly proud of it, in the way of oldest children who have learned that competence is its own form of distinction. Your middle one needed reminding and then reminding again, and then a third reminder delivered in a tone that communicated the absolute finality of the situation, after which he appeared, mostly correct, with his shirt tucked in on 3 sides and requiring quiet attention to the 4th before he went out the door. Your youngest needed help with her buttons and her hair ribbon and her left shoe, which was under the bed because it was always under the bed, and you provided all 3 with the swift efficiency of someone who has performed this exact sequence of assists so many times it has become a kind of liturgy, responsive and practiced and completed in under 4 minutes. You dressed yourself last, which was always the way. There was no point in putting on your good dress before the children were sorted, and you had learned this through the kind of experience that teaches things permanently. The dress that got a small handprint on it, the blouse that caught a child's breakfast on its sleeve, the hat knocked sideways by an enthusiastic goodbye hug at the front door. You dressed last, quickly, in the practiced way of a woman who knew how to put herself together efficiently, and you checked yourself in the mirror with the objective eye of someone assessing a result rather than admiring one, and the result was correct, and you picked up your gloves and your purse and went downstairs. The family assembled at the front door with 2 minutes to spare, which was victory, and you walked out into the Sunday morning together, your husband first, then the children in their particular order, then you pulling the door shut behind you, and the street received you the way streets received families on Sunday mornings in 1953, with a quiet acknowledgement of a neighbourhood doing the same thing at the same hour for the same reasons, everyone setting out together in their good clothes under the Sunday sky. The week's ordinary self briefly set aside in favour of something that asked to be dressed for. Sunday dinner was not simply the largest meal of the week. It was the week's emotional centre, the meal around which everything else quietly organised itself. You'd thought about it since Wednesday. You'd bought what you needed at Tuesday's market, and on Sunday morning before church you had started it. Put the roast in the oven low and slow, peeled the potatoes and left them in cold water, prepared whatever else needed time. By the time you came home from church, the house was already beginning to smell of it, and that smell, roasted meat and vegetables, and the particular sweetness of something cooking long and slow, was one of the defining sensory facts of 1950s American home life. It said, "You are home." It said, "You are cared for." It said, "This is Sunday, and we're all together, and nothing is required of us for the next few hours except to sit down and eat." Coming home from church to a house that had been cooking without you was one of the quiet domestic pleasures that no one thought to mention, because it was simply part of how Sundays worked, as assumed and unremarked as the Sunday itself. You opened the front door and the smell met you in the hallway. Not aggressively, not in the way of something that had been burning or boiling over, but gently, warmly. The smell of something proceeding correctly in your absence, the house having continued its work while you were away. Your children moved toward it instinctively, the way children move toward warmth, and your husband hung his hat and said something appreciative about how good it smelled, and you went to the kitchen and lifted the lid on the roasting pan and assessed what the oven had done in the 2 hours since you left, and it had done well, and the afternoon had its shape. The roast needed another hour at least, which was exactly right, because dinner on Sunday was not meant to be rushed. The interval between coming home from church and sitting down to eat was its own part of the Sunday, the hour of pleasant suspension when the meal was becoming but had not yet arrived, when the house smelled of it, and everyone knew it was coming, and the anticipation was itself a form of nourishment. Your children changed out of their church clothes and went outside or settled into the living room, and your husband dozed in his chair with the newspaper across his chest, and you moved between the kitchen and your own quiet tasks with the easy competence of someone whose work was proceeding on schedule and who had the afternoon to let it. You made the gravy from the pan drippings the way your mother had made it, working the flour into the fat with a wooden spoon until the roux was the right colour, not pale, not dark, but the specific golden brown that meant the flour had cooked long enough to lose its raw taste, and then adding the liquid slowly, stirring continuously, the gravy thickening in the pan with the satisfying gradualness of something doing exactly what it was supposed to do. This was the part of Sunday cooking you could not rush, and did not try to. The gravy took the time it took, and the kitchen filled with its smell, and you stood at the stove and stirred, and the afternoon moved around you at its Sunday pace. The table was set with the good tablecloth, the white one with the embroidered edge that had been a wedding gift and that came out only for Sundays and holidays and the occasional company dinner. You ironed it on Saturday, always, so that it lay flat and smooth, and entirely without the fold marks that a tablecloth kept in a drawer all week would carry. The good dishes, the good silver, 4 glasses filled with water, the Sunday water that somehow tasted like a meal worth sitting down to. You stood back and looked at the set table the way you looked at anything completed, with the quiet, private satisfaction of someone who cared about what things looked like and had made them look the way she intended. When the roast came out and was rested and carved and brought to the table, and the potatoes were mashed and in their bowl, and the vegetables were done and the gravy was poured into the good gravy boat and carried in carefully, and everyone was called and came and sat down, that moment, that specific moment of the family assembled around the Sunday table, with the meal before them, and the afternoon outside the windows and nothing requiring anyone's attention for the next hour, was the week's truest reward. Not for you alone, for all of them. But you had made it, and you knew you had made it, and the knowing was enough. After Sunday dinner was cleared and the dishes were done and the leftovers were put away, Sunday afternoon arrived with a kind of grace that nothing else in the week quite matched. Your husband dozed in his chair, your children were scattered through the house or out in the yard or lying on the living room floor with the funny papers spread around them like a small explosion of newsprint and colour. You might sit in the kitchen with a second cup of coffee and the quiet that follows a large meal and a full morning. The house settled around you like something breathing slowly. There was nowhere to be. There's nothing that urgently needed doing. The day had a completeness to it that was rare and gentle and fully earned, and you sat inside it the way you might sit inside a warm room during a rain, aware of it, grateful for it, present in it, in a way that the rest of the week rarely allowed. The dishes had been done with the help of your oldest daughter, who stood beside you at the sink and dried while you washed. The two of you working in the companionable rhythm of people who have shared this particular task enough times that it requires no negotiation and generates no friction. She told you something about school, something small and specific that she'd been saving for a moment when there was time to say it properly, and you listened in the way that washing dishes permits you to listen, with your hands occupied and your attention free, your eyes on the sink and your ears entirely on her. These sideways conversations conducted over dishes or laundry or the cutting of vegetables were often the truest ones, the ones where things got said that the formality of a face-to-face exchange might have made difficult. You stored what she told you in the quiet part of your mind, where you kept things that mattered and required no immediate action, but only the fact of having been heard. By 2:00, the house had reached its Sunday depth of stillness. Your husband's breathing from the living room had taken on the slow regularity of sleep. Your youngest was in the backyard in the particular absorbed way of a child who has found something worth investigating, a beetle or a stick, or the architectural possibilities of a patch of dirt, and required nothing from you except the general fact of your presence somewhere nearby. Your middle one had disappeared upstairs with a book. The house held all of this simultaneously, each person in their Sunday afternoon version of themselves, and you moved through it gently, clearing the last things from the dining room table, folding the good tablecloth with the care it deserved, returning the Sunday dishes to their shelf where they would wait another week. Then you sat down. This was the act that the whole week moved toward, though you would not have described it that way, because describing it would have required acknowledging how little sitting down you did between Monday morning and this moment, and the acknowledgement would have made the sitting down feel like a statement rather than simply a rest. You sat in the kitchen with your coffee, and the afternoon came through the window at its Sunday angle, warm and unhurried, and you let your shoulders settle, and your hands rest in your lap, and your mind go to the particular place it went on Sunday afternoons, which was not quite anywhere, which was the point. The funny papers were on the living room floor where your youngest had abandoned them when the backyard called, their colours bright and slightly garish in the afternoon light, the comic strip characters frozen in their weekly predicaments. You had read them yourself briefly after church, while the roast was in its final hour, not because you followed the strips with any particular investment, but because the funny papers were a Sunday object, as much a part of the day as the good tablecloth and the gravy boat, and reading them was part of inhabiting the Sunday rather than simply passing through it. This was something you understood about your own life without ever having articulated it, that the rituals were not incidental to the days but were the days, that the Sunday afternoon was made of coffee and funny papers, and your husband asleep in his chair, and your children scattered through the house and the smell of the meal just past, and that without these specific and ordinary things it would not have been Sunday at all, only a day. By Sunday evening you could feel Monday coming. Not with dread exactly. The week was simply the week, and you had never expected it to be otherwise, but with that familiar internal gathering, the quiet marshalling of what was needed. You laid out the children's clothes for Monday. You checked the pantry against the week ahead. You ran through the mental inventory of what needed to happen tomorrow and in what order, and you did this so automatically and so completely that it barely registered as a thought at all, only as a kind of readiness, the way a runner settles into position without making a production of it. The house was quiet. The lamp was on. The television murmured in the living room where your husband was watching the evening program, and you moved through the kitchen one more time, straightening, preparing, setting the percolator up for morning, and then you turned out the light. The week was over, another was beginning, and the house and the life inside it was yours. The children's baths were Sunday evening's first order, the week's accumulated outdoor living washed away in the tub before the new week began, each child emerging pink-faced and damp-haired and smelling of soap in the way that children smell of soap on Sunday evenings, which is one of the more specific and irreplaceable smells of family life in that era. You helped the youngest with her hair, working the towel through it and then the comb gently, section by section, while she stood in her pajamas with the patient resignation of someone who has learned that this is simply what Sunday evenings involve, and that arguing about it changes nothing. Your middle one bathed himself but required reminding about his ears, which you provided, and your oldest was already done and in her room by the time you knocked on her door to say good night, sitting at her small desk with her homework laid out for Monday in the organised way that was simply her nature, and that made your heart quiet with a pride you never said aloud, because saying it aloud would have made it self-conscious. You moved through the house in the Sunday evening light doing the small things that prepared it for Monday, the things that would make tomorrow morning move more smoothly, that would give the week a cleaner start, that no one would notice had been done but that everyone would have felt the absence of had they been left undone. The kitchen counters wiped and cleared, the school bags checked for anything that needed to come out or go in, the living room tidied of the Sunday's pleasant disorder, the funny papers folded and stacked, the coffee cups from the afternoon returned to the kitchen, the good tablecloth that had been airing over the back of a chair since dinner, folded and returned to the linen drawer with the careful precision of something that needed to last. Your husband watched his Sunday evening program with the absorbed contentment of a man at the end of a good weekend, and you sat with him for part of it. Your mending basket not out tonight because Sunday evenings were the one evening of the week when even the mending basket felt like too much, when what was called for was simply the sofa and the lamp and the television's murmur and the knowledge that the children were in their beds and the house was in order and the week ahead was as ready as you could make it. You sat and let the evening happen around you and felt, in the most uncomplicated way you felt anything, that the life you were living was a real one, made of real things, work and rest and meals and children and the long steady companionship of a shared house, and that the reality of it was not a limitation but a kind of wealth, the kind that did not announce itself and did not need to. When your husband went up, you stayed for a few minutes alone in the kitchen, as you often did, standing at the sink in the Sunday evening quiet with the window above it, showing you nothing but your own reflection in the dark glass and the faint lights of the neighbourhood beyond. The percolator was ready for morning. The children were asleep. The house held its Sunday evening breath around you, quiet and complete. You reached up and turned out the kitchen light, and the room went dark, and through the window the neighbourhood appeared, the lit windows and the dark ones, the familiar outline of the street, the oak tree in the backyard holding its shape against the night sky. You stood there for a moment in the dark and the quiet, not thinking anything in particular, not needing to. Then you turned and went upstairs, and the week that was ending gave way, gently and without ceremony, to the one that was about to begin. And so the week is done. You have walked through it room by room, morning by morning, through the cold kitchen floors and the soapy Monday air, and the golden Tuesday light of the grocery store, and the warm press of the iron moving down a shirt sleeve on a quiet afternoon. You have sat at the Sunday table and felt the week arrive at its proper destination. A family together, a meal prepared with care, a house that knew it was being looked after. It was not a glamorous life, not in the way that word is usually meant, but it was a full one, full in the way that matters, full of purpose and rhythm and the particular satisfaction of a thing done well and done again the following week, and done again after that, until the doing of it became its own kind of meaning. The women who lived these weeks did not think of themselves as remarkable. They woke up and made the coffee and sent the family out into the world and brought it back together again at the end of the day, and they did this with a steadiness and a care that held everything else up without ever asking to be noticed for it. They were the quiet centre of ordinary American life, and ordinary American life was in so many ways built from what they gave it. So tonight, wherever you are, take something small from their example. Light coming through a kitchen window, the smell of something warm from the oven, a moment held a little longer before the day makes its next demand. These things were enough for them. They can be enough for us. Rest now. The week has been met. The house is quiet. And you, like all the ones who came before you, have done enough. Good night.